3 weeks ago, I sat in a glass conference room 40 floors above a city I won't name yet, across the table from a man who manages more money than most countries collect in taxes in a year. And he said something to me that I have not been able to stop thinking about since. PAU's twos. He said, the people who lose everything in the next 10 years will be the ones who felt the safest right now. I have spent 40 years around money. I have watched booms turn into wreckage and wreckage turn into fortunes for the few who saw it coming. And I am telling you, I have rarely felt the kind of quiet unease I feel right now. I spent 11 days moving between 3 cities this spring, sitting in rooms with people whose job is to decide where billions of dollars go next. Not people who talk on television. People who never talk on television because their decisions do the talking for them. And what I am about to walk you through has a direct consequence for every dollar sitting in your bank account, your retirement plan, and your paycheck right now. This is not a story about some far off crisis for other people to worry about. This is a story about your money today. Here is the part that should bother you. Most financial advisors have never sat in the rooms I sat in this spring. They give advice built on the last 20 years, not on what the next 20 years are actually starting to look like. That gap between what the people who move the world's money privately believe and what the public is being told to do with their savings is the whole reason I am making this video. Ton, lower, slower. I cannot stay quiet about that gap anymore.
So stay with me through every single minute of this video, because at the halfway point, I am going to reveal the exact numbers that changed what I personally am doing with my own money after this trip. Not a theory, not a guess. The actual comparison that made me move real dollars. Do not skip ahead. What I show you first is going to make that halfway moment land with the full weight it deserves. And if any of this is useful to you, subscribe now, because I read every single comment personally, and I want you here when the next piece of this story breaks. Let me start with the moment that changed everything for me on this trip. I was sitting in a private dining room with 4 people whose combined decisions move more capital in a single afternoon than most pension funds move in a decade. These were not commentators. These were allocators, the people whose actual job is to decide quietly where trillions of dollars of other people's retirement money goes over the next 20 years. I asked them a direct question. I asked, if you had to put your own family's money somewhere for the next 10 years and you could not touch it, where would you put it? Every single person in that room gave me a version of the same answer without hesitating. One of them said it in exactly 9 words. Not where everyone else's money already is. Pause twos. I asked the same question 3 days later in a different city to a completely different group of people. Central bank advisors this time, people who spend their careers thinking in decades, not quarters. I got the same answer. Word for word almost, that is not a coincidence. When people who never talk to each other, who work for competing institutions in different countries, give you the same answer to the same question within the same week, you pay attention. That is what a real signal looks like, not noise signal. Now let me be honest with you about something, because I think you deserve honesty before I ask you to trust anything else I say in this video. Tone, lower, slower. 36 years ago, I made the biggest financial mistake of my life, and it nearly cost me everything. I was young, I was certain. And certainty, I would learn, is the most dangerous feeling a person can have with money. I had borrowed $4,000 from my father to make an investment I was completely convinced could not fail. I told him it was a sure thing. I told my wife the same thing. We had a 1-year-old daughter at the time, and my wife was pregnant with our second child, and both of them depended on the decisions I was making with money we did not have room to lose. The investment failed, not slowly, fast. Within 4 months, the $4,000 was gone, and so was a piece of my confidence I would not get back for years. I remember sitting at our kitchen table doing math on a napkin, trying to figure out how to tell my wife that the money her father-in-law had lent us in good faith was simply not coming back. That was one of the hardest conversations of my life. Pause twos, and it taught me the most important lesson of my entire career. I learned that the most dangerous financial events in history never feel dangerous while they are happening. They feel exciting, they feel obvious, they feel safe right up until the moment they are not. I carried that lesson into every decision I made for the next 3 decades. And it is the lesson sitting underneath everything I am about to show you. And here is the revelation I promised you at the halfway point. After that dinner, after those conversations in 2 different cities with people who do not normally agree on anything, I went back to my hotel room and I pulled up the actual numbers because I never trust a feeling until I have checked it against the math. Here is what I found. The stock market benchmark that most people's retirement accounts are quietly tied to is currently trading at close to 35 times what the underlying companies actually earn in a year. To put that in plain terms, if you bought one of those companies outright with cash, and it kept earning exactly what it earns today, it would take you 35 years just to get your original money back through profits alone. That number has only been higher one time in the last 100 years, right before the dot-com collapse in the year 2000. Compare that to a completely different kind of asset. Physical gold, the same asset governments and central banks have trusted for over 5,000 years, has no earnings ratio at all because it does not depend on a company's future profits or a government's future promises. It simply is what it is. And one of the largest financial institutions in the world, a firm that manages money for the wealthiest families and largest pension funds on the planet, published a forecast this year projecting that a standard 60/40 stock and bond portfolio will return roughly 3% a year over the next 10 years. Oh. NCE, you account for the rising cost of living. 3% a year for 10 years on the exact portfolio structure that most retirement accounts in this country are built on right now. Let that sit with you for a second. 3% a year is barely enough to keep up with the rising cost of groceries, let alone actually grow your wealth. That is the number that made those 2 rooms full of allocators on 2 different continents give me the same 9-word answer, not where everyone else's money already is. But here is what I need you to understand beyond the numbers themselves. This is not the first time in history this exact pattern has shown up. And understanding that pattern is what separates people who protect their wealth from people who watch it quietly shrink. Go back 500 years and you can trace this same story again and again in empire after empire. Let me give you 2 examples because once you see them, you will start seeing this pattern everywhere. In 1944, at the end of the Second World War, the world agreed that the American dollar would be the currency every other currency was measured against, because it was backed by gold and backed by the strongest economy on earth. That agreement was called Bretton Woods. For almost 30 years, it worked. Then in 1971, the United States government announced that dollars could no longer be exchanged for gold. Overnight, the entire global financial system shifted onto a currency backed by nothing but trust and government promises. The people who understood what that shift meant moved into hard assets like gold and land. Over the next 10 years, gold rose by more than 20 times its value. The people who kept all their savings in cash watched inflation quietly eat away at what that cash could actually buy year after year, even while the number in their bank account stayed the same or even went up a little. Here is a second example from 1923 in Germany. After losing the First World War, the German government owed enormous debts it could not pay, so it printed money to pay those debts instead. In the beginning, this felt like it was working. Prices rose slowly at first, so slowly most people did not notice. Then the printing accelerated and prices began doubling every few days. A loaf of bread that cost a few marks in January cost billions of marks by the end of that year. People who had spent their entire lives saving cash, doing everything they were taught was responsible, watched decades of savings become worthless in a matter of months. But the people who had moved even a portion of their savings into hard assets, gold, land, foreign currency, kept their purchasing power almost completely intact. In 1923, hyperinflation happened in Germany. The result was the complete collapse of an entire generation's cash savings. And then over the next 10 years, the gap between people who understood that lesson and people who did not became the difference between families who rebuilt and families who never fully recovered. You can see the same pattern again in 1956, when Britain's involvement in the Suez Crisis triggered a run on the British pound and accelerated the decline of the pound as the world's dominant reserve currency, a decline that had been building quietly for decades. You can see it again in 2008, when a financial system everyone believed was rock solid turned out to be built on debt nobody had properly priced for risk, and trillions of dollars in wealth evaporated in a matter of months for people who assumed the system could not break. Every single one of these moments felt different while it was happening. Different country, different decade, different headline, but underneath it is the same mechanism playing out again and again. A currency or a financial system built on trust and promises instead of something real. A government that owes more than it can realistically pay back. And a period where that gap gets quietly papered over with more debt and more printed money, right up until the moment the math simply cannot be ignored anymore. Now let me bring this back to today, because history is only useful if it helps you see the present more clearly. Here is what is happening right now in plain numbers. Central banks around the world bought gold in the last 2 years at the fastest pace in more than 50 years. Not a small handful of countries, dozens of them buying quietly month after month, while telling the public through official statements that everything in the financial system remains completely stable. Gold itself has risen sharply over the past 18 months, even while most financial commentary on television barely mentions it. And foreign holdings of American government debt, the bonds that fund a large part of government spending, have been declining as a share of total ownership for over a decade, even as the total amount of debt being issued keeps climbing. To translate that into your actual life for a moment, if why? Our grocery bill has felt heavier over the past few years. That is not your imagination. If the number in your savings account has grown a little, but somehow buys less than it used to, that is not a coincidence either. That is the same slow shrinking of purchasing power that hit savers in Germany in 1923, just moving at a dramatically slower, quieter pace. It does not announce itself with a headline. It does not feel like a crisis while it is happening. It just quietly, patiently, eats away at what your work is actually worth. And here is the part that should really bother you. The same institutions that publicly tell ordinary savers to stay in a standard mix of stocks and bonds are in many cases privately reducing their own exposure to exactly those assets and increasing their own exposure to gold, hard assets, and international diversification. That is the gap I sat inside of during those 11 days. Not a conspiracy. Just a simple, uncomfortable fact. The people who understand the mechanism are making different decisions with their own money than the advice being handed to the public. So let me tell you exactly what I personally did after that trip, and exactly what I am telling you now, understanding fully that this is not advice for you, only a transparent account of my own positioning, so you can decide for yourself what, if anything, applies to your own situation. Action 1. I moved a portion of my portfolio, roughly 15%, into physical gold exposure using widely available and heavily regulated exchange-traded funds like GLD or IAU. These are not exotic instruments. These are the same instruments that people who understand this mechanism use to protect their own savings, and they trade through any standard brokerage account the same as a normal stock. Action 2. I reduced my concentration in the single stock market benchmark that most retirement accounts are built around, bringing it down to under 50% of my total portfolio, specifically because of that 35 times earnings number I showed you earlier. Concentration in one expensive market is exactly the kind of certainty that hurt me 36 years ago. Action 3. I diversified a meaningful portion of my international exposure using a broad global fund like VXUS, spreading risk across multiple economies and multiple currencies, instead of depending entirely on one country's financial system staying strong forever. Action 4. I increased my allocation to inflation-protected government bonds, specifically TIPS, because unlike a standard bond, these are structured to adjust upward as the cost of living rises, which directly addresses the 3% forecast I mentioned earlier. Action 5. I built a larger cash reserve than I have held in years, not because cash is a growth asset, but because history shows that the people who survive periods of financial stress with their wealth intact are almost always the people who had enough liquid cash on hand to avoid being forced to sell their other assets at the worst possible moment. These are not exotic instruments. These are the instruments that the people who understand the mechanism use to protect themselves, available through any ordinary brokerage account, no special access required. I just told you what I saw in those rooms across 2 cities from people who rarely agree on anything. Here is what that means for your money in one sentence. The financial world you were taught to trust without question is quietly shifting underneath the surface, and the people closest to that shift are already repositioning their own money, whether or not they say so publicly. Pause 2s. The window to make thoughtful decisions, calmly and on your own terms, rather than reactively once the shift becomes obvious to everyone, feels like it is closing. I am not telling you what to do. I am telling you what I did and why, so you have the same information I had when I made that decision for my own family. If this video gave you something to actually think about, subscribe, because I am going to keep tracking these numbers as they develop, and I want you here for the next update. And before you go, I want one specific thing from you in the comments. Not your opinion, a number. What percentage of your own portfolio is currently outside of the standard stock and bond mix you were handed by default? Write that number below, just the number. I read every single comment personally, and I want to see where this audience actually stands. Want to be notified when Claude responds. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.